It's August 17th, 1943. Just another day for the men of the U.S. Army Air Corps in England. Dawn breaks over the mist-shrouded countryside of East Anglia to reveal a scene of bustling activity. Ground crewmen hurry about making last-minute preparations for the day's mission. Bombs are loaded, engines are tuned, machine guns are cleaned, while every round of ammunition is checked and rechecked. In nearby Quonset huts, thousands of aviators anxiously await the start of today's briefing. Silently, they pray that they'll be given a milk run, perhaps a rail yard in France or a German airfield in Belgium. But when their grim-faced commanders step before them, they know that today's mission will be a rough one. All this activity centered around one objective: to get the 8th Air Force's fleet of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses into the air and over their target. The B-17
from the Eastern Front and give assistance to the Russians. They weren't prepared at the time to launch a ground invasion of Europe, so they used the bombing campaign to try and get at German industry, reduce their ability to put out equipment, and also to divert weapons and production of weapons to anti-aircraft systems and to fighter production, and also in diverting German aircraft to defense of the fatherland. All those planes that were flying against the bombers weren't flying against the Russian armies.
It was a modern marvel, armed with 13 machine guns and capable of flying 2,000 miles or more with its load of deadly explosives tucked inside its bomb bay. The world had never seen such power in an aircraft, and only the most advanced nation could have even conceived of such a destructive weapon. Each flying fortress carried aloft 6 miles of electrical wiring within its metal frame. Its generators could light all the rooms in a good-sized hotel. Each B-17 carried enough steel for 160 washing machines and enough aluminum for 50,000 percolators. The rubber used in its wing deicers could retread almost 1,000 automobile tires. Each B-17 cost almost $500,000, a huge sum for the time. The B-17 was truly an American weapon, complex, expensive, huge, larger than life. And it had been built for a uniquely American role: daylight precision bombing, a role that was hoped would shorten the war by knocking out factories vital to Germany's war effort. And on this day in August of 1943, the B-17s and their crews would set out to prove that they could get the job done. Far from a milk run to France, the targets for today would be the Regensburg Messerschmitt plant and the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt.
Schweinfurt had dozens and dozens of ball bearing plants and factories around the city. In fact, Schweinfurt produced between 30 and 40% of all the ball bearings used by Germany and its allies. So the philosophy was, if you could knock out the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt, the German Army and Air Force, actually, and Navy, would grind to a halt because they wouldn't have ball bearings, which was a key component to any mechanical item.
The 8th Air Force would be sticking its head right into the Tiger's jaws, and the Tiger would be waiting. With the briefing concluded, the bomber crews climb aboard trucks and jeeps for the short drive to their own flying forts. The B-17s are ready to go. The mechanics and armorers have worked through the night to make sure that every bomber is fit to fly. The plan calls for two groups of bombers to coordinate their attacks on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The 4th Bomb Wing's 139 B-17s would go in first, hitting the Messerschmitt factory, then flying on to North Africa in an effort to confuse the German defenses. Meanwhile, close behind the 4th Bomb Wing would come the 1st Bomb Wing's 222 flying fortresses. They would sneak in behind the 4th and destroy the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt. Bad weather ruined the plan. The Luftwaffe almost ruined the mission. The B-17s form up over England before heading out toward Germany. The 4th Bomb Wing is already 90 minutes late. They'll be lucky to reach North Africa by sundown. As the first 139 bombers cross into Belgium, the second wave of bombers still hasn't even left the ground back in East Anglia. In fact, the 1st Bomb Wing would be delayed 5 hours. The attackers would go in piecemeal, and the Luftwaffe would tear them to pieces. The 4th Bomb Wing is attacked first. Scores of German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rip into the bomber formations. They concentrate on the trailing squadrons in the 15-mile-long bomber stream.
The Germans threw something on the order of 300 fighters at these 147 B-17s, and the low group was the most vulnerable, and the 100th Bomb Group earned its reputation that day that has stuck with them for 60 years, 50, 60 years, as being known as the hard luck outfit. They called it the Bloody 100th. Anyway, they went in, the Germans went in, made head-on passes at the high boxes, went down through the low boxes, and then just clobbered the 100th. And I think the 100th lost.
But the remaining flying forts dropped their bombs with startling accuracy. The Messerschmitt factory is utterly destroyed. Scramble every fighter in northwest Europe. They're surprised when the 4th Bomb Wing heads south toward Africa. But they have plenty of targets anyway, for right at that moment, the Schweinfurt-bound Boeings of the 1st Bomb Wing reach the continent. They're set upon by hundreds of German fighters. The B-17s are hacked out of the sky with frightening frequency. One American gunner watches in horror as 12 bombers fall in flames around him, spilling white parachutes all over the sky. One combat wing loses a third of its planes. Entire squadrons are shot up, and only the Boeing's inherent rugged durability keeps the disaster from getting any worse. Of the 222 B-17s in the second raid, 196 reach Schweinfurt. So shot up and shocked are the crews that they scatter their bombs all over the city. The ball-bearing factories are hit, but not knocked out.
The area where the ball-bearing industry is located was definitely, for first impression, devastated. But as I walked from the airbase, there was no public transportation in Schweinfurt at that time, to the railroad station. I noticed that certain sections of the big factory, there was still steam coming out. They were still operating, still working.
the battered survivors turn for home and fight their way back out of Germany. Those flying forts that still remain in the formations are almost all peppered with holes. Flak has claimed a few bombers, but most have been hit or downed by aggressive fighter attacks. Just before dark, the bombers reach home. The 4th Bomb Wing straggles into its assigned airfields in North Africa, a spent and demoralized force. Of the 120 B-17s that reach Tunisia, 60 are so badly damaged they will never fly again. The 4th Bomb Wing has lost 78 of its 139 planes. In England, the sky is filled with battered B-17s limping home. Some of the bombers reach East Anglia with 1 or 2 engines out. They crash land on any available airfield as ambulances and fire trucks race toward their shattered hulks. By the dozen, wounded airmen are pulled from the twisted wreckage and carried away to local hospitals. There'll be a lot of empty seats in the mess halls of East Anglia tonight. Altogether, the great Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid cost the 8th Air Force 60 B-17 shot down. Over 600 men were killed or captured. Scores more are wounded. Of the remaining B-17s, 147 of them are written off as unrepairable wrecks. Fully 40% of the 8th Air Force's bombers are knocked out on August 17th. Precision daylight bombing, the very reason the B-17 had been invented in the first place, had failed in the face of Germany's deadly air defenses. Still, the 8th Air Force's leadership would not give up. The bombers would soon fly again. The bloody losses over Regensburg and Schweinfurt can be traced back to the U.S. Army Air Corps' concept of strategic bombing that evolved during the 1920s. After the brutality and trauma of World War I, military strategists began to look for ways to avoid the horrible stalemate of trench warfare. Air power advocates such as Hugh Boom Trenchard, Julio Duhay, and Billy Mitchell believed that the next war would see another tragic deadlock on the ground. With the land armies trapped in the morass of trench warfare again, the only route to victory would be through the air. Trenchard and Duhay believed that by sending vast fleets of bombing planes to destroy enemy cities, a nation could be forced to surrender. These terror raids would cause civilian morale to break, destabilizing a nation and possibly even causing a revolution. With the enemy government collapsing at home, its armies would not be able to continue the fight. American air power advocates didn't like the idea of randomly killing civilians. Instead, they decided that the best way to victory would be to knock out the enemy's ability to produce the weapons of war. By destroying arms factories, aircraft assembly plants, ball bearing plants, and other such strategic targets, an enemy's army and air force wouldn't have the means to carry on the fight. They would be forced to surrender as their nation's wartime economy crumbled under the weight of this precision bombing campaign. American air leaders fervently believed that such a bombing campaign could bring swift success at a low cost. By throwing everything into such an effort, the attrition of trench warfare could be avoided and total victory could be achieved. It wasn't until 1935 that the Americans developed a bomber capable of carrying out such a grandiose strategy.
Well, B-17 was a four-engine heavy bomber designed in the mid-1930s by the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. And its primary role was to destroy enemy industrial targets through high-altitude precision bombing. And in that role, it was uniquely suited. It turned out to be one of the best aircraft probably ever built for the role that it was designed for. Mainly because, first off, at high altitudes, the B-17 was an amazingly stable aircraft. The reason for that was the fact that it had a very large wing. With a large wing area, the plane was very stable in flight. It was an excellent bombing platform. And most importantly to the crews was the fact that because it was stable, they could fly in very tight formations, so they could stick together.
The Boeing Model 299, prototype of the Flying Fortress, flew for the first time in August of that year. It would take several more years of development before the first production models reached operational squadrons, but when they did, they were the best and most modern bombers in the world. For its time, the B-17 was huge. With its 100-foot wingspan and 70-foot length, it towered over other late 30s aircraft. Later versions, including the B-17G, came equipped with 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines that cranked out 5,520 total horsepower. And the Fortress needed every bit of power to drag aloft its typical bomb load of 14 500-pound bombs over a distance of 3,600 miles. Top speed was about 290 miles per hour, but in tight formations and heavily loaded, the Boeing cruised at about 170. With its heavy defensive armament of 13 machine guns, the Air Corps believed that the B-17 could successfully fight off enemy interceptors without help from escorting fighters. This was a major issue as the Air Corps didn't have any fighter aircraft capable of flying long distances with the bombers. But since the Flying Fortress had so many 50 and 30 caliber machine guns, such a long-range escort fighter seemed unnecessary. The B-17s would strike their targets alone, flying in tight, mutually protecting formations. In 1943, the 8th Air Force unleashed its first sustained bombing campaign against Germany. Codenamed Operation Point Blank, the B-17s were sent to knock out the Third Reich's aircraft industry. By destroying the Luftwaffe's production centers, the 8th Air Force would gain control of the air over Europe. With that in hand, the bombers could be sent against other strategic targets, striking at the heart of the Reich's ability to wage war. Point Blank was the first clash between the American pre-war doctrine and the realities of modern air combat. The results were soon clear, but the Americans doggedly persisted in putting their theories into practice at the expense of thousands of brave young men.
About the time we dropped the bombs, we started getting hit real close. One engine got hit, started losing oil, waited till there was not enough oil pressure. They couldn't feather the engine. So then they windmill just from the air. And eventually they may twist the shaft off and the prop will come off. God knows where it'll go. Or they can shake a wing loose, I guess. Not a very good situation. And I don't remember if it was in that engine or another one, the fire started. I don't know if they got that one out or not. And apparently the underside of the 17 was pretty well shot up. Sort of dropped out of the formation and started losing altitude. And wasn't too long till the pilot rang the bailout bell. And that was it for that mission.
The most important flaw in the precision daylight bombing campaign was the lack of a long-range escort fighter. Even the B-17's numerous defensive guns could not protect it from determined German fighter attack. The Luftwaffe soon learned to hit the B-17 formations from the front, which proved to be the weak point in the Boeing's defensive systems. Sometimes 40 or 50 Me-109s or FW-190s would swoop down at the bombers in a blazing head-on pass, aiming for the cockpit and engines. Nothing could stop such devastating attacks, and the fortresses took appalling losses.
Our biggest concern, really, in all honesty, were the young men that were over there before I got there. They had a lot of fighters that they had to contend with. The average mission completions that they had, I think, was about 7. And here we finished 35, so that tells you something right there.
If you lost an engine, or if you feathered an engine, that was very apparent to the Germans. And they'd pick on you right now. And they liked to make holes in a formation. If they could knock a plane out of formation, you were definitely crippled. They knew how to do that.
Without long-range fighter escorts, the 8th Air Force's B-17 groups lost 40% of their crews during 1943. Only a quarter of the bomb crews were able to fly a full tour, 25 missions, and go home that year. An average crew flew 5 to 7 missions before getting shot down. Some who flew longer usually came home more than once with a shot-up bomber and injured crewmen aboard. Randall Jarrell, an 8th Air Force airman, wrote a poem that captured all the horror and intensity he and his fellow Flying Fortress crews faced in a piece titled The Death of a Ball Turret Gun. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak in the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Such losses had a profound effect on morale and on the emotional health of the remaining B-17 crews. With buddies going down on every mission, the men became fatalistic. They clung to good luck charms and became increasingly superstitious. Others gradually lost their combat edge as battle exhaustion wore them out. In some cases, men broke down entirely and became psychiatric casualties. About 4% of all 8th Air Force losses in World War II were psychiatric cases. These were men who performed their duty admirably until the stress and strain of constant combat finally broke their emotional back. Such men were called flak-happy by their peers, or said to have the Focke-Wulf jitters.
During the war, the 8th Air Force suffered roughly 50,000 KIA, WIA, and MIA. Tremendous amount of guys lost their lives or were physically injured. But also, as the stress and strain of combat began to manifest themselves on these crews, it became clear that the 8th Air Force was going to have to do something about psychiatric casualties. They were starting to lose crews, starting to lose pilots, starting to lose gunners to emotional trauma. And so one of the things that the 8th Air Force did was they set up a series of rest homes for crews that had been through particularly horrendous ordeals. Or later on in the war, they were sent there just as a matter of course. These were called flak leaves, and they'd go back to these country manors way out of the way from any military installations, and they would be able to eat and relax, and that actually helped get some of the emotional problems that the crews were suffering under control. Now, this never threatened operations for the 8th Air Force. It was always a very small number of the crews. Wartime reports had it that of every 1,000 men that flew combat, with the 8th Air Force, 42 were going to become psychiatric casualties of one sort or another. And they were called permanent psychiatric cases if they were not returned to flight duty within 15 days. During the war, about 4,000 airmen and pilots fell into this category.
Through these brutal months, the crews learned to love their B-17s. The Flying Fortress had a ruggedness that sometimes defied imagination. They came home with 2, sometimes 3 engines knocked out and great gaping holes torn in their aluminum skins. Control shot away, landing gear ruined, hydraulics blown out, flaps gone, and chunks of wing or tail hacked out by cannon shells didn't stop the rugged Flying Fortress. They came home limping, shattered and ruined, but still able to get their crews safely on the ground one final time. Hundreds of B-17s would return to England, never to fly again. They would be dragged off to the boneyards, where their broken bodies would be picked clean of spare parts that could be used to keep the other planes flying. To their crews, these faithful planes were utterly beloved.
We've flown on 2 engines, but you're coming downhill. That makes a lot of difference. You don't have fuel, you don't have bombs, and you're coming downhill, and you can go long ways. But the old B-17 was a tough son of a gun. It can just get holes all over it, and it's still going to come back. The B-17 just had a great big old slab, and it flew real slow. And it wasn't real high compression, so it could take a lot of punishment.
One way the crews expressed their deep feelings toward their planes was through nose art.
Nose art had some significance. It was a means to personalize a very impersonal weapon. A military aircraft is not a very personal thing, especially when 12,000 of them just like it are flying around in the world. So this was their way, the crew's way, to put their unique stamp on their aircraft and make it their own. And once that happened, that aircraft ceased to become just a collection of metal bolts and welded pieces of aluminum. It became almost a living, breathing part of their integrated crew. And so when you talk to crews who had their own aircraft for an extended period of time, they feel very, very strongly, very passionately towards that airplane, especially the B-17s that were so faithful and so rugged. And the crews will talk about their aircraft almost as if they were people.
With worn-out crews and demoralized bomb groups, the 8th Air Force continued to attack targets in Germany even after the August 17th Regensburg-Schweinfurt debacle. While nearly half of the 8th Air Force had been knocked out in that one air battle, the Americans believed that the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg had been totally destroyed, making the effort worth the cost. Post-war analysis later confirmed that the destruction at Regensburg cost the Germans some 1,000 Me-109s in lost production. What the Americans didn't realize was that the German aircraft industry was expanding at such a tremendous rate that those 1,000 planes were insignificant. Never once during the war did the Germans suffer from a lack of interceptors. In October of 1943, the 8th Air Force launched another concerted effort against targets in Germany. On October 8th, the B-17s bombed Bremen, losing 30 out of 399 planes. The next day, 36 more B-17s were lost attacking aircraft factories at Ochlum and Marienbad. The missions continued, and the stress on the crews grew even worse. In 1 week, from October 2nd through the 9th, the Germans shot down or damaged beyond repair over 100 flying forts. The 8th Air Force lost almost 1,000 men. And still, the worst was yet to come. On October 10th, the B-17 struck Münster. The Luftwaffe bored in on the bombers, concentrating on the low squadrons of the 100th Bomb Group. Flying a straggly, loose formation, the 100th turned out to be easy meat. Within minutes, the entire group was virtually wiped out. Hitting Münster cost another 36 B-17s and over 300 Americans. The lesson from Münster was clear. Flying in loose formations would get many men killed.
There was one group that flew pretty scraggly formations, yes, elements or formations. Some of them consequently were hit harder than ours. Our group flew good, tight formations. They wanted the wing of the side plane tucked right in behind the wing and in the waist of the other. In other words, tight elements of three. By having those wings all tucked in, concentrating the firepower from all the guns aboard each ship, it was a pretty good deterrent that the Germans wouldn't come in too close and attack us. They liked to go after the disabled planes that had drifted off from them and got back here by themselves.
I think one reason that our group didn't have the casualties that some of the groups, some of the squadrons, is we were a little knot up there in the sky. I could always spot our group. It was just tight.
Then on October 14th, the crews assembled in the briefing rooms to learn they would be going after Schweinfurt once again. The news was received by a chorus of groans and shocked gasps amongst the exhausted crews. Still, they climbed aboard their B-17s to do their duty, knowing that today, many of them would not be coming home. They flew into a holocaust of flak and fighters. The Germans were waiting for them, and as soon as their short-ranged P-47 escorts turned for home, the 109s and 190s attacked. They swarmed through the B-17 formations, blasting the bombers out of the sky with cannons, rockets, and machine guns.
Well, we were going into the ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt, and it was pretty tough going. Heavy flak, he'd shot at from every direction, and I don't really know what happened, except some people in our squadron that saw us get shot down. They said one of them rockets shot us. It was obviously a lost cause, and the pilot was losing it, and so they jump out, and I had the last shot that they hit us with had concussion had blown me back against the bulkhead and unplugged my oxygen and my intercom system. And I was a little while, when I finally come to, I realized I didn't hear anybody and my oxygen thing wasn't moving. And so we were only 18,000 feet that day. So I went back to the cockpit, and I was the only guy on that airplane. Everybody else had jumped out. And so I run back and snap my parachute on and jump out. They had this big thing that they'd been trying to stop. With the Germans were shooting Americans in parachutes, and the Americans were shooting Germans in parachutes. And both sides were trying to stop it. And here come two Me-109s right at me. They kept getting closer and closer. When they got almost up to me, they reared up like that and circled right tight around me, and both of them saluted. So I saluted, and they went away. And so I just landed in second growth timber, which was no harder than jumping off the bed.
As the raid drove deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe responded by throwing everything that could fly into the air at them. Even obsolete Ju-87 Stukas attacked the P-17s, dropping aerial bombs into their tight formations. One bomb group, the 305th, lost 12 planes out of its 27 before even reaching the target area. Those B-17s that reached Schweinfurt dropped their bombs as best they could through a growing pall of smoke that partially obscured the ball-bearing factories. Entire groups missed their targets, and their bombs fell all over the countryside. So many German fighters had attacked the flying forts that most of the American gunners were now running out of ammunition. Meanwhile, the German 109 and 190 squadrons were able to land to rearm and refuel in time to attack the bombers again. Low on ammo, the desperate bomber crews turned for home and endured hour after hour of deadly fighter attack and heavy flak. By the time they reached home, the surviving crews were burnt out and beyond the breaking point. Of the 229 B-17s sent out that day, 60 were shot down, 7 were written off, and 138 more were damaged. Over 630 men of the mighty 8th were either killed, wounded, or captured. In 2 weeks of operations that October, the 8th Air Force had lost over 200 bombers, nearly half its total force. Worse, there was little to show for the terrible casualties. Something had to be done, or the Germans would win the air war. The Army Air Corps had learned its lesson. It was time to throw the pre-war book away and figure out a new way to hit the Germans. The war would not be won with a quick knockout blow against Germany's wartime industries. Rather, it would take a long, sustained campaign to meet 8th Air Force's objectives. And to sustain such an operation, the bombers would need long-range fighter escort.
Well, initially, the 8th Air Force only had P-47 groups available, and they had a very limited range. They could only get to just about the German frontier and back, so they were not able to escort the bombers all the way to target. That posed an increasing problem as the Luftwaffe caused more and more casualties to the 8th Bomber Command. So during the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force began investigating the use of drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be slung underneath the fuselage and the wings of their P-47s. So they got very large fuel tanks, up to 108-gallon tanks, I believe, is among the ones that they used. And that was actually able to extend the P-47's radius of action by 100 miles. So they were able to actually go inside Germany and actually could get 375 miles out from England and back. So that had a major effect on the air war, because the P-47s now didn't have to just turn around over Belgium. They could actually tangle with the Luftwaffe over Germany. But at the same time, after the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force began demanding long-range fighters. And, of course, the only one that was available at the time was the P-38. So in October of 43, the very first P-38s began escorting the bombers, and while they were not as effective as the P-47 or later the P-51, the 38s could at least provide some protection for the bombers, and they could actually go to Berlin and back.
With winter closing in, the 8th Air Force flew less frequently in the final 2 months of 1943. When it did, it confined its attacks mainly to targets outside of Germany. The B-17s would wait for better weather. In the meantime, the 8th Air Force would get new leadership, and they would change America's approach to the air war. In October, General Karl Spaatz took over command of all strategic bombing operations in Europe. He at once realized that the only way to win the air war was to drive the Luftwaffe out of the sky. The air war would become a battle of attrition, the same sort of grueling.
The whole nature of the air war had changed. We were no longer trying to avoid the Luftwaffe. The 8th Air Force's primary mission was destroy the Luftwaffe before D-Day. And to do that, we had to draw them out. And the only way to draw them out was to pick targets that the bombers could go after that were significant enough to the Germans to get them to defend it. And so really the bombing campaign became less an issue of destroying targets on the ground as it was drawing the Luftwaffe into a fight so the long-range fighter escort could take them out.
The flying fortresses had become bait. At the end of February 1944, a 5-day break in the winter weather allowed the 8th Air Force to launch attacks deep into Germany against aircraft factories and airfields. The Luftwaffe rose to the defense and waded into the bomber stream with a vengeance. But then the Lightnings, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs protecting the B-17s pounced on the Germans, savaging their ranks. While the bombers took heavy losses, the Luftwaffe's interceptor units were badly mauled during the week-long battle. 2 weeks later, the 8th Air Force went after Berlin. On the 6th of March, the Germans managed to down 69 B-17s over Berlin. In doing so, however, the Luftwaffe broke its own back. As they desperately tried to defend the Nazi capital, the 109s and 190s were set upon by American fighters and blasted from the sky. On March 8th, the B-17s returned to Berlin, and once again a violent battle raged. When it was over, the German interceptor force had been crippled.
Somebody yelled, "Lightnings!" And I looked around. My gosh, there I saw the lightnings. And they came down, and all of a sudden I saw streamers go by. I said, "Oh boy, somebody's at my tail." And I went a little lower, and by that time I heard a loud bang, and he had cut off part of the right wing, and I just cut and instinctively put her down.
When the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin the next day, hardly a German fighter was seen, much to the delight of the bomber crews. For the next 3 months, the battle of attrition played out in all its bloody finality. The Germans lost more pilots than they could possibly replace, while the American units were reinforced regularly and never suffered from a shortage of crews. It was a race to see which side would die faster and which side would run out of warm bodies to throw into the fray. It was a race the Germans could not win. From Big Week to the end of May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 28 of its top aces. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter force and 17.9% of its pilots defending the Reich. March proved even worse for the Germans, as they lost fully 56% of their fighter aircraft and 22% of their remaining pilots while trying to defend Berlin. Such casualties could not be sustained. The Germans started the year with 2,283 available fighter pilots. By May, 2,262 had been killed or wounded, a 99% loss rate. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, and it was the 8th Air Force that was causing the bleeding. While Allied fighters blasted the Luftwaffe from the sky, the bombers still had targets to hit. Former B-17 crewman Les Hardy takes us on a typical mission deep within the heart of the Third Reich.
They'd wake you up probably 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and run you down for chow, breakfast, and we didn't get eggs. Somewhere I read that on a combat day you got real eggs. They missed us. We got those powdered eggs, but the cooks did a good job on them. And then by the time you went through briefing and got your flying gear on, your heated suits, you had to wear heated suits or you'd freeze to death up there. And then assembled out at your airplane and got the information from your officers if they had anything. The navigator would usually tell us what the weather was supposed to be over the target. And then we'd form up over England, which was quite often dangerous because it might be going through clouds. It was very foggy. They didn't even attempt it, but it wasn't unusual to have air-to-air collisions while you were forming up. But eventually we'd get formed up and in formation and head across the channel. And you were stuck in that airplane for quite a few hours when you went to Berlin. No nothing to eat. I think they gave us a candy bar. One time they gave us an orange. That works real good at 28,000 feet, 60 below. We could have thrown those at the enemy. Getting to Berlin, quite often we encountered flak because they had their 88s mounted on rail cars and trucks, and they moved them around, and I swear they knew where we were, what our flight pattern was. Because quite often we'd get flak on the way, and you didn't dodge around it. You had to stay on your course. But as you approached Berlin, if some other group was ahead of you, the air was black with flak, and that's what you had to fly through. On the bomb run, the bombardier, the pilot turned the thing on autopilot, so the bombardier controlled the airplane on the flight over the target, because he's the one that's aiming the Sperry at the ground. And so he just flew through that like that was the only way to go. And it was very exciting. I'd like to have been able to shoot at something, but of course I couldn't do that. I could see plenty good through the top of my radio shack. It was wide open. The two little windows on the side weren't very good for seeing things, but I could see enough. Probably all I wanted to.
With the Luftwaffe on its knees, the 8th Air Force turned its attention to supporting the D-Day invasion and subsequent campaign in Normandy. The flying fortresses hit coastal emplacements and other targets along the beaches just prior to the landings, then took part in carpet bombing operations against German troops. One such mission virtually destroyed the German Panzer Lehr Division in July of 1944 and helped pave the way for the American breakout from the beachhead. Once the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began driving toward Germany, the 8th Air Force turned to new targets in hopes of shortening the war. Up until early September of 1944, the heavy bombers had mainly attacked aircraft factories, U-boat assembly plants or pens, docks, and ball-bearing factories. In May, the bombers had begun hitting oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants. D-Day delayed hitting any more of these targets until the fall of 1944, but in September, the mighty 8th returned to Germany and systematically destroyed the Reich's ability to process fuel. The attacks were an incredible success. By December, the 8th Air Force had knocked out almost half of Germany's refineries, precipitating a fuel crisis within the German army. Just when the Wehrmacht needed mobility the most, its panzers ground to a halt for want of oil and gas. Desperate measures were tried to get around this problem, including the construction of charcoal-burning engines that tanks could use, but they were too little, too late. The Flying Fortress had at last delivered the knockout punch the pre-war bomber advocates fervently believed it could do. At the same time, the 8th's bombers were used to attack marshalling yards and rail centers throughout Germany.
Mainly, most of my missions in those days were the marshalling yards. We were trying to destroy the transportation system so they couldn't move anything around by train. And we did. We really destroyed the area, because later on when I went to Germany, it took me 5 days to go on train, because they had to go all over the place, because they had to go where the tracks were still left. But that was mainly what we were doing at the end of the war, is bombing the tracks, train tracks, marshalling yards, destroying any moving stock. By the end of the war, most of everything that the Germans had was already destroyed. It was really destroyed.
Destruction of the Reich's rail net proved to be one of the Flying Fortress's most significant contributions to the war effort. German industry depended on the railroads to deliver raw materials and carry away finished products. By late 1944, the railroad system had all but collapsed under the weight of B-17-borne bombs. Even the barest necessities could not be transported effectively via rail by the end of 1944. Coal, the lifeblood of German industry, piled up near the mines, with no way to get it to the factories that so badly needed it. By January, this caused a full-scale collapse of the German economy. And still, even as Nazi Germany twisted in its death throes, the B-17 crews continued to take heavy losses. No longer were German interceptors much of a threat. With thousands of bombers and thousands of fighters ranging across the Reich, the Luftwaffe had been all but swept from the skies. Flak, however, was a different matter entirely. The Germans concentrated hundreds of anti-aircraft batteries around crucial oil targets until some factories were defended by over 1,000 heavy guns. Using radar guidance, late-war German anti-aircraft fire brought down thousands of American aircraft, fighters, medium bombers, and even the high-flying B-17s.
There was another air raid in the afternoon, and here came the 8th American Air Force. I think it was a multi-effort because I think I counted over 90 planes or 100 planes, B-17s, and the German aircraft artillery apparently had them just right. All of a sudden I saw one bomber blow up and 9 parachutes and another one. And at one time I counted 27 parachutes.
Flak became the worst menace the B-17 crews faced.
Our biggest fear was the flak, because when I got there, we were really making strides on the ground, and we were pushing the Germans back, which time they're bringing all their flak guns back and concentrating them in the cities. So when we started into a target and you looked up ahead, it looked like a piece of white paper with a drop of ink drops down all over the paper. It was just a massive airspace of black flak bursts. And we were losing a lot of planes because of that, too.
It was a milk run, which is supposed to be an easy mission, just across the channel to a Luftwaffe airfield in, pretty sure it was France. Now, it could have been Belgium, but hard to remember. Anyhow, 3 airplanes. It was a big mission. And we went storming over there. I think we even left at a decent time in the morning. And as I say, a milk run, that means you're not supposed to have any trouble. Well, we didn't until we got over the target on our bomb run, and they cut loose with very accurate anti-aircraft fire. And we're plastering stuff all over us. We were flying on number 2 spot, the airplane on the starboard side of us. Took a hit, must have been oxygen tanks. And something got fire, and of course, fueled by oxygen, it's a holocaust. So we could see the guys, some of them bailing out. I don't remember how many chutes we saw. But what really impressed me, this plane kept flying right along beside us, and the pilot, who I had flown a practice mission with, tall, slim guy, real tall, he crawled out the pilot window because of the fire. I'm sure he couldn't get out. I don't know how a guy even got through that pilot window, and reached inside and got his parachute, chest back, and slid off of the wing. And I didn't know whether he got his chute on or not. In fact, it was reported that he did not. Later, a year or so later, I found out he had made it to the ground and no problem.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't register what I had seen or hadn't seen. We had our wingman right opposite us. We were in the target area and hadn't been hit ourselves. And all of a sudden, there was something that caught my attention on our right side. Looked over there, and the plane that was supposed to have been there wasn't there anymore. I looked around to see, well, maybe it went up a little higher, and I looked backwards, and there wasn't any behind. I looked down, and I couldn't find that plane's position. I looked again, and I could see parts of the plane falling and gotten a direct hit. I guess it must have been the whole charge or two from ACAC. Must have hit him right in the, blew him up. That was, there it was and there it wasn't. I don't think there was a soul probably got out of that plane.
By the end of the war, over 12,000 B-17s had been produced. The B-17G, with its additional twin-gun chin turret, was the most numerous version, with 8,680 being built. The 8th Air Force, which used the vast majority of the B-17's Boeing cranked out, lost 5,200 bombers during the war. Over 50,000 of the 8th Air Force's pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and radio operators were killed, wounded, or captured during the course of the strategic bombing campaign. Without the incredible ruggedness of the B-17, these shocking numbers would have been even higher. Was it worth it? For decades, historians have argued the pros and cons of the strategic bombing campaign in Europe. All agree that the B-17 didn't win the war against Germany alone, as the bombing advocates had theorized before the war, but the B-17 still played a key role in the victory over Hitler. The bombers wrecked Germany's oil industry, ensuring the defeat of the Wehrmacht by the Allied armies. More importantly, however, the B-17s drew out the Luftwaffe in the spring of 1944 during Big Week and the Berlin raids. In doing so, the bombers helped achieve complete air superiority over Western Europe as the German interceptor force ruined itself defending Berlin from the thousands of flying fortresses and the fighters the 8th Air Force was able to put into the air. This bloody victory set the stage for the Normandy invasion. For had the Allies not had complete control of the air, D-Day might never have taken place. When the war ended in Europe, the B-17's heyday came to an end. By 1945, the Flying Fortress was a 10-year-old design. Rugged, tough, and always a warrior, the B-17 nevertheless could not survive in a world that would soon see jet fighters, atomic weapons, and guided missiles. The 8th Air Force's 2,000 B-17s were collected together in fields all over England, where they were either flown back to the United States or scrapped on site. And thus, the B-17's last contribution may have been its most significant. These majestic planes were melted down and their metal used to help rebuild Western Europe. The destruction they had once wrought was repaired by their very skins. A noble end indeed. Today, only a few B-17s exist to remind future generations of the air war that raged so many years ago. Each flying fortress is a treasure, for they remain lonely signposts of the struggle that once raged in the bloody skies of Europe. Battles on land leave scars in the earth to mark their passage into history, but the sky over Europe reveals no secrets and tells no tales. The sky remains unchanged, unchangeable, as it had for the eons prior to those black-torn years of World War II. In these skies, titans once clashed. An epic struggle for survival unfolded amidst these clouds with stakes so high, entire nations would be destroyed. Young men by the hundreds of thousands were flung into the maelstrom of this desperate battle as the fighting reached its bitter climax. Over 60,000 young Americans and Germans would never return home. Their lives snuffed out in the air over Nazi-held Europe. In the end, through their courage to clamber aboard their faithful B-17s for mission after mission, these men of the mighty 8th Air Force helped free Europe from the dark tyranny of Hitler's Germany. Their legacy of freedom and of peace. The idea for the consolidated B-24 Liberator came in the late 1930s when the Army Air Corps realized the need for a long-range heavy bomber that would not only be a counterpart to the older B-17, but would surpass it in performance. Flying faster with a wider range and with more bombs to deliver to the target, many thought that the designers of the B-24 had succeeded in their quest to make a better bomber. And on August 1st, 1943, in one of the most important Allied air attacks of the war, the B-24 would get the chance to prove itself in the most difficult of conditions. 176 consolidated B-24 Liberators carrying over 1,000 American aviators were to strike the oil refineries around Ploesti.
It was an extremely tough target. There was a high concentration of anti-aircraft, and both the 88 and 105 millimeters. They had a large concentration of German aircraft, and I think they also had Romanian Air Force aircraft also. Oh yeah, we heard a lot about it during training, and we were expecting to fly Ploesti when we got there.
These targets supplied Hitler's war machine with almost 60% of its oil products. If Ploesti could be destroyed, the German army could be stopped in its tracks and the Luftwaffe's fighters starved for fuel. To General Louis Brereton, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Air Forces and the man who ordered the attack, 50% losses would be a small price to pay if such success could be gained. Brereton insisted that the bombers go in on the deck and bomb from 250 feet. The group commanders, as well as the commander of the 9th Air Force, protested the order in writing. Brereton refused to relent. The mission, he felt, was too important. Ploesti had to be destroyed. For 2,400 miles, the bombers hugged the earth en route to target.
Each group had one of the refineries and their targets. They were to stay at low level all the way across the Mediterranean to stay out of radar contact, then cross over Yugoslavia into Romania.
The mission began to unravel as soon as the Liberators took off from their Benghazi area airfields. Nearby, watching the American planes get aloft and head out northward, were 3 German spies. They would not be caught until April of 1944. So on this day, their fervent warnings to German headquarters on Crete would doom hundreds of American airmen. The mission had been compromised. The Germans knew the Liberators were coming, and they'd be waiting. Over the Mediterranean Sea, things got worse. In the lead group, the 376th, a B-24 flown by Captain Glenn Flavelle, suddenly pitched up and out of formation. Wingo Wango, the name of the B-24, stalled, then fell into the sea with a tremendous explosion. Flavelle's wingman disobeyed standing orders and turned back to the crash site, hoping to drop a rubber life raft to any survivors. They found none, and when the B-24 swung back round on course, the 376th was too far ahead to catch. Reluctantly, they turned for Africa, carrying with them the deputy lead navigator for the entire mission. That would not have been a critical error had not the mission's lead navigator gone down with Flavelle's Wingo Wango. As it was, the 2 most experienced navigators who had been specially trained for this complicated attack were now out of the equation. Colonel Keith Compton, the 376th Group's commander, now took over navigating the raiders to Ploesti. Over Yugoslavia, Compton's pilots ran into heavy cloud cover as they neared a mountain range. As they climbed through the clouds to get over the peaks below, the B-24s briefly reached 16,000 feet. A nearby German radar set detected the bombers. Axis fighters from all over the Balkans were scrambled to stop the onrushing Liberators. Passing the mountains, Compton dove his group back down on the deck. As they reformed just above the ground, the 376th was alone. Weather had scattered the other groups. the strike would go in piecemeal. The plan had called for the bombers to make their attack from the north, swinging around Ploesti before turning south to come in from the most unexpected direction. Compton, however, made a serious navigational error. His crew mistook the initial point and turned too early, hurtling the 376th not at Ploesti but at Bucharest. 3 of the other 4 groups also suffered some sort of navigational lapse. The remaining group, Colonel John Killer Kane's 98th, was the only one to fly the assigned route and get to Ploesti on time. Rather than one hammer blow, the raiders dribbled into Ploesti from different directions. From 250 feet, the B-24s that reached their oil refinery targets were greeted by thousands of anti-aircraft bursts, scores of tracers from machine guns emplaced near their targets, and by 320 German, Romanian, and Bulgarian fighters. In the end, it was pure carnage. The liberators dumped their 500 and 1,000-pound bombs on the vulnerable refineries. When they detonated, they blew huge chunks of debris hundreds of feet into the air. Onrushing liberators had to dodge the flying cascade of metal as their bombardiers fought desperately to pick out a good spot to toggle their bombs. One B-24 was nearly swatted out of the sky by the top of one of the enormous oil storage tanks that had been blown off by a direct hit. Other B-24s followed on the heels of the first wave. All around them, flames and smoke were belching from blazing oil tanks and lines. Through the smoke, the liberators emerged, sweeping around the 210-foot smokestacks as anti-aircraft fire savaged their ranks. Individually, they toggled their bombs, then dove back down to ground level and sped frantically for home. The Germans had a flak train at Ploesti, and the canny crew raced along the tracks, almost pacing the bombers.
The flak trains were going around 50, 60 miles an hour as the planes came in at 150, 160, 180, depending. And they were just paralleling. And as they came down the valley, the flak guns were just hitting them, and they became some pretty sharp targets for the flak gunners.
The AA gunners had point-blank targets that required little lead. They couldn't miss. Bomber after bomber brewed up into brilliant incandescent explosions, shedding wings, engines, and tails as they billowed into the ground. Several times, liberators were caught in the flames flaring up from the damaged refineries below. Colonel John Kane's B-24 went right through one such funnel of fire.
When the 98th came in, Kane turned at his proper place, went to his proper target, but he found his target was already in flames. And instead of aborting it, he said, we're going to go on, stay on our course, and just go on and go according to plan. So he brought his planes right in through the smoke and through the fire. Bombs were exploding, planes were going through. Out of the 98, he lost 22 aircraft. So that's out of 40, 50 planes, he lost 22 alone.
Last into Ploesti came the 389th Bomb Group. Smoke and fire almost totally obscured their targets, but still they clung to their mission. Wrote Captain Philip Ardrey, a squadron leader in the 389th. Already the flames were leaping higher than the level of our approach, and there were intermittent explosions lighting up the black pall. A gauntlet of tracers and cannon fire of all types made me despair of ever covering those last few hundred yards. Ardrey's wingman, Lieutenant Hughes, was hit in the left wing. From a gaping hole, fuel began gushing out. An instant later, the torrent caught fire and a tongue of flame blasted back from the wing and totally engulfed the fuselage and tail. Hughes held his Liberator on course. Soon the entire left wing was ablaze. The B-24 had only seconds to live, but Hughes' bombardier released their bombs, scoring direct hits on the refinery. The bomber came off target and Hughes turned for a nearby river, hoping to save his crew. But the plane began sagging toward the ground, and as they came to the river, Hughes was forced to try to climb over a bridge. The Liberator had no life left, and the maneuver caused it to pitch over and cartwheel across the river's muddy bank. With the 389th's attack complete, all of the B-24s were now racing for home, but they would not escape unharmed. Hundreds of German interceptors waded into them, and the exhausted gunners fought with all the intensity of trapped animals. It was not enough. More and more B-24s smacked into the Balkans countryside, leaving a trail of burning wreckage from Ploesti all the way through Yugoslavia. "73 B-24s went down on this Ploesti raid, 50 alone over enemy territory. Another 55 were damaged. Over 500 American airmen were killed or wounded. About another 100 were captured. 5 men, including Hughes and Kane, received the Medal of Honor.
This raid over Ploesti really demonstrated the courage and the dedication that the American airmen involved in the mission possessed. And that did not go unrecognized by the high command in the Mediterranean. And in the end, there were 5 airmen on that mission who were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is America's highest award for bravery. And there has been no mission since, and there was no mission before, that garnered so many Medal of Honor winners. It really stands as a testament to not only the bravery of the crews, but also to the difficulties and the harrowing experience of what it was like in the inferno over Ploesti.
General Brereton claimed 60% of Ploesti's production capability had been destroyed. In reality, while the destruction the raid caused had been heavy, Ploesti's refineries had not been operating at full capacity at the time of the raid. The Germans and Romanians mitigated the damage by bringing online previously unused sections of their facilities. Ploesti would go on pumping oil into the heart of the German war machine. Never again would the B-24s go in on the deck. For the next 2 years, Ploesti would be pounded time and again by the 15th Air Force's massive force of liberators. By the time the Russians captured the target, little was left but scorched and twisted metal. Far from one lightning stroke, it took scores of missions, 360 lost B-24s, and over a year to finish off Ploesti. In the meantime, to the airmen forced to attack it, the name Ploesti would be etched in their nightmares for the rest of their lives.
They knew that Ploesti was one of the most heavily defended targets in the world, not just in Europe, but in the world, with 128 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on rails, plus the 88s, plus the light flak, the medium flak, if anybody came back at low altitude again. It was an inferno, it was a cauldron, and we lost hundreds of bombers over Ploesti, lots and lots of men. And so to the crews who flew those missions, it was one of the roughest things they probably experienced in their lives.
The plane that the men rode into the Inferno over Ploesti that day in 1944 stemmed from a late 1930s call by the U.S. Army Air Corps for another heavy bomber that could complement the B-17. Consolidated's Model 32 won the design competition, and on December 29, 1939, the first prototype took flight. Dubbed the XB-24, the plane immediately impressed the Army Air Corps. Fast, capable of carrying more bombs than the B-17 over a longer range, the new bomber had the striking power that the Army coveted.
A lot of pilots didn't like the B-24s, but I loved it. I just thought the B-24Ds and Es were just a real good airplane. You had to fly them. It wasn't like a 17. The 17, you know, was a floater. It was like a C-47 or such. It had a big wing, and the B-24 had what they called a Davis airfoil, which was a narrow wing. That you had to have more speed for takeoff and landings, while the 17 landed at a lower speed and so forth. And the B-24 carried more bombs than the B-17 and was faster than the 17. But the B-24 was built during the war for the purpose, like the Liberty ships. They were just for the battle, and after the battle was over, they got rid of all the B-24s. But I liked the B-24. I felt comfortable in it.
Indeed, the plane attracted so much notice that by 1940, both the British and French had placed large orders for it. Called the LB-30 in RAF service, the bomber initially served with Coastal Command, where it hunted German U-boats in the Atlantic. In 1942, the first B-24D variants arrived to join operational U.S. AAF bomb groups. With a max speed of 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, the Liberator was some 20 to 30 miles per hour faster than the older B-17. Its four Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines produced a total of 4,800 horsepower. Ten 50-caliber machine guns protected it from enemy interceptors, while its mammoth bomb bays could hold up to 12,500 pounds of ordnance. At first glance, the B-24 appeared to be the ultimate strategic bomber, one with which the Army Air Force could crush Nazi Germany's industrial base. For all its assets, the B-24 had a number of very serious flaws that made it far less beloved by its crews than the B-17. Most serious, the Liberator could not take nearly the beating that the Flying Fortress could.
It seemed to me that about half of our missions we had malfunctions of one type or another, either caused by the combat or sometimes just happened. Get halfway to the target, and one of the engines would go completely out. Oil would spurt out. No oil. Have to feather that engine and then turn around and come back rather than continue. So it was a problem, major problem, and they did everything they could to keep them going, but as I said before, they lost half of the planes that we had by the end of the war, one half. Incredible.
While the B-24 wasn't exactly fragile, it certainly was not in the same league with the rugged, tough machine that Boeing produced. All too often, Liberator missions turned into tragic tales of death and destruction at the hands of enemy fighters. B-24 pilot Bill Foster recalls just such a mission over occupied Europe.
We lost an engine, and there were fighters around, but they weren't really attacking our squadron. But I don't know whether a stray bullet, maybe just a hose flew off or what, but we lost our oil pressure on one engine. And so we feathered the engine, and we just couldn't keep up. We fell back, and we were the last one with a photographer on board. Then we lost another engine, caught on fire, and the fighters were attacking. That's when they really came in from all sides. Then they had this ME-110, a twin-engine fighter with the rockets. I'd never seen a rocket or heard of one, but we could see them going by us, and they were the ones that really did all the damage. They hit our waist and killed 2 or 3 fellows in the back. They shot all our engines off, or they quit, and all of a sudden my controls, my rudder controls just went out. I had no control of that at all, and same way with the ailerons. So I yelled, "Let's go." We had to go up through the hatch, and we're lucky our airplane had that top hatch because they all didn't. It was only 2 foot square about, and that's where we went up, all of us on the flight deck. And just as I was standing there ready to go up, I see Pete, my navigator, coming up from the bomb bay, and I got up on top and helped him up, and we were the last 2 out of the airplane. My intention was to walk all the way back the airplane on top of that fuselage and jump off the tail. But just as I started out, the plane lurched, and I fell down on the right wing and rolled off through the flames. The whole trailing edge of the right wing was on fire, and I rolled off through that, and I must have passed out because I don't remember pulling the chute, but I woke up and I was being lifted up in the air by the chute opening, and the airplane was not too far off, and I saw it crash just, probably a city block from where we landed. One fella, early in the mission, when we were first attacked, he had his foot blown off, and we issued morphine to him, or I had to give that to him. And we thought that he had been, when we counted the chutes, we thought he had been blown out, but we found out later that they threw him out, and he was alive when he went out, but he landed in a tree and bled to death. The tail gunner was killed in the turret. The ball turret down below, he was killed just getting out of his turret. I don't know how he knew, but the photographer told me that he took a rocket right in midsection. The worst one was the nose gunner, who he had his turret over to one side. And it was shot out. The controls were shot out. The bombardier tried to wind him back in mechanically, and it couldn't do it. So he died screaming. He was in the airplane when I left.
Besides being less than durable, the B-24 with its narrow wing tended to wallow above 20,000 feet. This made it a mediocre bombing platform and made tight defensive formations above that altitude impossible to fly.
Controls are very mushy on a B-24, extremely mushy. That means when you're flying in tight formation, you're constantly moving throttles and the rudders and the ailerons all the time, just continually moving them. It was hard work. After we worked 15 minutes apiece, the pilot, 2 pilots, and after 15 minutes, you're ready for a rest.
Our best fighter cover, this isn't a fact, but that's the way we felt, was B-24s. They kind of flew this way. It's tough for them to fly formation. So if the fighters picked on anyone, they'd go after them.
It wasn't as stable as the B-17, so the B-24 guys couldn't fly as tight formation as the B-17s. And so the Germans would see the looser formations flown by the B-24 groups, and they would go in and wade into them, launch their attacks at the ones who looked like they were straggling a little bit. So tight formations had to be maintained even until the end of the war, otherwise you were a target.
To help offset the B-24's inability to fly tight formations, Consolidated equipped the J model with a nose turret that sported a pair of .50 caliber machine guns. While the additional firepower helped, It cut the Liberator's speed down to 278 miles per hour and reduced its radius of action to around 1,000 miles. The B-24J was also a foot longer than the D model, measuring 76 feet from nose to tail. Thanks to the new nose turret, its empty weight had jumped from 32,000 pounds to almost 40,000 pounds. The B-24 also turned out to be hard to fly. Small pilots usually could not handle the Liberator, as the rudder controls were so heavy and taxing that they required a bigger man with strong lower back and leg muscles. At times, it took both the pilot and co-pilot working together to operate the rudders effectively.
Flying formation, it was real heavy on the rudders. We all got what they call B-24 knees, especially at altitude. And I had a pretty severe case of that, but it didn't last.
Never loved like the B-17, the Liberator would nonetheless provide yeoman service in the U.S. Army Air Force. Never flashy, but always capable of getting the job done, the B-24 equipped the entire 3rd Air Division within the 8th Air Force. By mid-1944, the 15th Air Force in Europe flew B-24s almost exclusively. In the South Pacific, the B-17 initially served as the mainstay of the heavy bomb groups. By mid-1943, however, the B-17s were giving way to the longer-legged B-24s. Eventually, the Liberator entirely replaced the Flying Fortress in the Pacific. By war's end, the B-24 had been produced in greater numbers than any other American aircraft. No fewer than 18,482 Liberators rolled off of assembly lines throughout the United States, including the famous River Rouge plant in the Midwest. Both the Army Air Force and the Navy used the B-24 in a variety of roles, a fact which made it more versatile, if not more respected, than the B-17. Liberators were employed as high and low altitude bombers, night intruders, skip bombers, transport aircraft, and for long-range maritime patrol missions. Few aircraft in American history have been adapted for as many uses as the B-24. Its very versatility made it one of the great designs of World War II. The B-24 first saw action for the Army Air Forces with a secret unit called the Halverson Project, number 63. Nicknamed HALPRO, this small group of 23 Liberators and 231 men left Florida in May of 1942 with orders to bomb Tokyo. Led by the loud and abrasive Colonel Harry Hurry-Up Halverson, the detachment flew from Florida down to Brazil, crossed the Atlantic, and then passed through the interior of equatorial Africa. Turning north, HALPRO's Free Spirit pilots landed at Khartoum, Sudan, where the British halted them. German raids were hitting other airfields along the chain of strips HALPRO planned to use to get to China, where they had orders to operate from a series of primitive fighter bases in the Zhejiang province.
The original mission, my understanding is, was to go to Khartoum. Then from Khartoum, they were going to go to Shenzhen, China. And then they were going to bomb Tokyo, or Japan, from Shenzhen, China. But then Shenzhen was overrun by the Japanese. So that's what killed the Halverson project. But the original group was to go by way of Egypt over to Shenzhen, China, then from there bomb Japan.
All of a sudden, HALPRO's entire purpose had been rendered moot. They were orphaned in the middle of nowhere with no mission and no orders. Halverson's intrepid little band ended up joining the British Desert Air Force in Egypt. From there, his remaining B-24s began flying tactical support missions for the 8th Army as it battled Rommel around Tobruk.
We didn't have any command over there at all. We didn't have an Air Force command like 9th or 8th or anything like that. We were just a group. And the British were having problems with Rommel. Rommel was knocking at the doors of Cairo, and that's when the British asked for the B-24's support in bombing Rommel's supply lines and his ships bringing supplies in. So we took our orders, we got targets and orders from the British, or at least Kane did, and we were assigned missions.
On one mission, Halverson's B-24s actually attacked an Italian surface task force composed of cruisers and battleships.
Malta was an ideal post out there that could pick up the convoys coming from Italy and Germany. Would have to bypass off the coast of Malta, and when the information on convoys came through, it was passed on to our bomber command or group, and we were told what to look for and where to find them or anticipate finding them. So we'd go out after the ships in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's not easy to hit a maneuvering ship, because by the time you drop your bomb and that ship goes and changes course to a different direction, your bomb isn't going to hit. But we did get ships. We did damage them or cripple them. And then the British submarines in the area would finish them off if possible.
Then in June of 1942, the USAAF commander Hap Arnold came up with a new and dangerous secret mission for Halpro. Instead of flying on to join the fight against the Japanese or staying in Egypt where they would continue to fight Rommel, Arnold ordered Colonel Halverson to attack Ploesti. Originally, Halpro's pilots were supposed to fly from Egypt, skirt Turkish waters, then turn north to fly up through the Balkans to strike the oil fields, then head back south. As the navigators worked the course out, they discovered that they probably wouldn't have enough fuel to get home. Instead, the American officers who arrived to brief them told the crews to land in Iraq. That shortened the flight to about 2,600 miles, but still the B-24s could not possibly fly that far with the 3,600-pound bomb load they had been ordered to carry.
Hurry-Up Halverson was not the kind of guy who was going to risk the lives of his men to satisfy some political decision or political need on the part of the Allies. So just before this mission was flown, he walked in to the briefing room, saw his crews, and looked at them and said, "All right," pointed at a map, said, "This is the most direct route." And he pointed across Turkey. "We're going to use it." And so, oh, and by the way, flying at low altitude, that's not going to happen either. So they went up to their normal bombing altitude. They crossed Turkey illegally. They bombed Ploesti and came back across Turkey illegally. But they did so and got back. The ones that got back had actually enough fuel to get back. There were some that got interned in Turkey and one that ended up in Iraq. But for the most part, that decision probably saved many lives on that mission. Otherwise, had they gone the route that they had been originally ordered to go and at the altitude, they probably would have been shot down to the last plane or run out of gas on the way home.
To the pilot's relief, Halverson knew that any other way into Ploesti would guarantee a suicide mission. On June 11, 1942, the mission began. Halpro's raid on Ploesti was the first American raid on the European continent, and it was the first raid on the critical oil fields that would later absorb so many American bombs. 12 B-24s made it over Romania, where one bombed ships in a Black Sea harbor and the others hit the oil refineries around Ploesti, then turned for home. Alpro's first Ploesti mission never received much publicity, and the low-altitude strike a year later, on August 1st, 1943, soon eclipsed the single pinprick raid. Halvorsen himself landed in hot water for taking his men over neutral Turkey. He then ended up destroying his career when he began arguing with his British superiors in Egypt.
After that first Ploesti mission, Halvorsen locked horns numerous times with his British superiors, who complained to Washington enough so that he eventually got recalled, and that destroyed his military career. He came home kind of in ignominy and ended up retiring from the service as a colonel and didn't see any further action in World War II. It's kind of a tragic end to a guy who was really loved by his airmen.
Alpro had ceased to exist, but in its short combat career it had proved the value of the B-24. A year later, hundreds of B-24s were operational from the North African desert to East Anglia to the frozen Aleutian Islands through to the jungles of New Guinea. On every front where the Army Air Force saw action during World War II, the B-24 served as a key player in the heavy bomber forces. In the Pacific, the long-range Liberators were used by Kenny's 5th Air Force as both low- and high-level bombers. One B-24 group, the 380th, flew out of Darwin, Australia for much of the war, where they struck repeatedly at the Japanese occupation forces of the Dutch East Indies. The 380th grew experienced at low-altitude night anti-shipping missions, as well as night intruder missions against ground targets. Later, the B-24s from the 380th would strike at another key oil installation, Balikpapan. Sometimes called the Ploesti of the East, the refineries around Balikpapan supplied Japan with most of its oil and aviation gas. Initially, the 380th Bomb Group went after Balikpapan by itself, in daylight and at night. Unescorted, its B-24s suffered heavy losses.
In 1944, General Kenny, the commander of Far East Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, felt that if his heavy bombers could knock out Balikpapan, Borneo, and the oil fields and the refineries around that city, that they could force the Japanese to surrender. Balikpapan was seen sort of as the Ploesti of the East, as the big holy grail target for the Southwest Pacific Air Forces. And that was really wishful thinking. The Japanese weren't going to surrender because they didn't have an oil refinery in Borneo. With the arrival of the 13th Air Force and their B-24s, he actually had enough bomb groups to actually make a sustained heavy series of strikes on Balikpapan, and he took advantage of that opportunity. And he personally visited the bomb groups to try to buck up morale and get those guys behind this operation.
In the early days of October, the bombers flew the 1,200 miles to the target and back alone. In the process, Japanese interceptors knocked down many of the raiders. Kenny's B-24 groups couldn't withstand such losses. Short on crews and with few replacements in sight, he had to figure out a way to protect his B-24s, or he wouldn't have enough bombers to cover the coming invasion of the Philippines. Fortunately, his 5th Air Force fighter groups found a way to get their P-47s and P-38s from Morotai to Balikpapan and back. Starting October 11, 1944, the bombers went to the refineries covered by swarms of little friends. The Japanese rose to greet the attackers and were massacred by the P-38s and 47s. Balikpapan was hit hard, though the refineries were not totally knocked out. The Balikpapan raids were the longest missions of the war in the Pacific for the fighters that accompanied the B-24s. Some of the fighter pilots were airborne for over 8 hours and landed with just a few drops of fuel remaining in their tanks.
The problem was the target was not really worthwhile. The Japanese didn't have the shipping left to haul all the oil up to Japan, so whether or not their production facility there was destroyed was really immaterial. The reality was they couldn't get the oil that was even being produced at that point to Japan. There just weren't the tankers left because the American submarine campaign had just ravaged Japan's sea lanes.
While Kenny's B-24s were pounding Balikpapan, over in England, the liberators of the 3rd Air Division, 8th Air Force, were being used to hit targets deep in Germany. Early on, operational experience showed that B-17s and 24s could not really operate together as they had very different cruise speeds. As a result, the 8th's B-24s were separated into their own air division and were frequently used on feints and diversionary attacks. This secondary role grated on the Liberator crews, who knew their aircraft could strike targets anywhere in Europe. Finally, the 8th began sending the 3rd Air Division on more meaningful missions, always covered by hundreds of escort fighters. The B-24s were still more vulnerable than the B-17 and needed as much protection as possible. 8th Air Force Liberators spent 1944 and 45 hitting cities and factories deep in Germany, Poland, and Austria. At times, only the 8th's P-51 Mustangs had the range to follow the B-24s to their distant targets and back. Across Europe, losses continued to be heavy. German fighters were becoming less of a threat, but large concentrations of flak guns began to take their toll.
The plane that had been on our right, as they went over the target, they got a direct hit right in the waist. And when the flak exploded, or whatever it was, well, it had been flak, exploded inside the plane. And it just looked like a little ruffle, like kind of bulged out, you know, all the way around the plane. And at that mission, I was a fly in the waist, and he was just right there, you know, where I could look right out there and see him. And pretty soon, where that expanded out, the plane broke in two, and the engine just tilted up and went straight into the ground, and the tailpiece went up over the plane behind them, and then ducked down and went down underneath the plane, the next plane. It just flipped. Lucky. Not for them, but for the guy behind, the two planes behind him, they were real fortunate.
Not only did the air crews have to worry about flak and fighters, but they also needed to be aware of more insidious, less common ploys the Germans used to try to bring down the Allied bombers.
One time that there was a B-24 come in and tried to join up with us, tried to get into our formation, you know. They had that top turret just going round and around there, trying to persuade us that they could come in, you know, and join up with us. But we wouldn't let them, because we didn't know. Because they had captured some of the planes and were flying them themselves. And so the engineer then put off a flare, and they couldn't answer the code with the flares, and so they backed off, and that was the last I seen of them. That was quite prevalent, you know. They'd warned us about this, that don't let a plane in, that unless you're absolutely sure, and that was why the flares were supposed to acknowledge, you know, that was one of our group.
If a captured plane were able to get into a tight formation of B-24s, it would have the potential to do substantial damage. In Italy, the 15th Air Force, by 1944, had been fighting a war of its own against the soft underbelly of the Third Reich. The 15th's B-24s routinely hit targets in northern Italy, Austria, Eastern Europe, and, of course, Ploesti. In 1944, however, with the arrival of the P-51D, these Mediterranean-based liberators were able to strike Berlin from the south, and have a protective fighter escort through the entire mission. The Berlin raids were fiercely contested affairs, and the 15th B-24 crews were hit by everything the Luftwaffe had left, including the Me-262 jet fighter. Again, losses were heavy, but the 15th kept up the pressure, providing, along with the 8th Air Force, a constant 1-2 punch against the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the B-24 groups in Europe took part in several highly unusual missions. During the Allied effort to cross the Rhine, the largest airborne assault of World War II was made by American and British paratroop and glider units. Fighting alone and isolated on the eastern side of the Rhine, these men quickly ran low on supplies. A massive effort was made to get food, ammunition, and medicine to the brave paratroops, but the number of transport planes proved insufficient for the task. Liberator units all over East Anglia were then loaded with supplies and flown over the Rhine area battlefields at under 1,000 feet, where they dropped their precious cargoes to the desperate men below. The Liberators' cavernous bomb bay turned out to be ideal for such missions, but flying the huge B-24 at such low altitude in the face of light and medium anti-aircraft guns could be exceedingly dangerous.
The American paratroops and glider forces really took a beating from German anti-aircraft fire. And when their resupply B-24s came in, they got hit by the same AA fire. And many B-24s were shot up going in that low. They were a huge target. They were badly shot up dropping supplies to the paratroops. And they lost a dozen B-24s with many more damaged on this mainly mission of mercy, something that the B-24 had never been designed to do, really. And it was one that inspired some bitterness among some of the crews.
As the war dragged into its final weeks, the Liberator played one last role, one in which it would be long remembered by suffering Dutch civilians. Allied air planners received word in the spring of 1945 that Holland was starving. Cut off from Germany, the Nazi-held sections of the Netherlands had run out of food and fuel. The entire civilian population was in jeopardy of starving to death. The 8th Air Force came to the rescue. The B-17 and B-24 groups swarmed low over Holland, dropping canned food, powdered milk, and sea rations by the ton on the grateful population. As the war ended, the 3rd Air Division's B-24s continued to fly these missions of mercy. Through their efforts, thousands of Dutch lives were saved. For the men who flew these supply runs, they were the most rewarding missions of the war, the ones they remember with the most pride.
They converted all our bombers. Every bomber that took part in the raid was converted. We put wooden platforms in the bomb bays, hinged them on one side on the bomb racks, and fixed it so the bombardier could, when he dropped, toggle the bombs. Instead of bombs, the doors came open, these wooden doors, and what we had stacked on the doors would fall out. The Dutch civilians had marked the fields where they wanted us to drop. They put a white cross. But I did hit the White Cross one time. You know, it's kind of interesting because sometimes I can remember my commanding officer, his airplane, they were having trouble. The doors open, but the boxes didn't fall out. So they also furnished a long stick in the airplane so that the person, actually was a flight engineer, could take the stick and poke at things. So I can remember watching the commanding officer's airplane going around and one box at a time falling out. I could watch, I remember one hitting a cow. There's a cow down there and the cow just turned over. I watched a couple go through the roofs of houses. That was home delivery. Just went right through the roof. But I tell you, the Dutch civilians really appreciated what I do. I think that to them now it's like a holiday. that they really celebrate the fact that we saved their lives.
With the end of the war, the B-24 disappeared from American service with surprising speed. Liberators in Europe were lined up by the hundreds in fields across England and Germany where they were summarily scrapped. The few that returned to the United States were quickly mothballed in aircraft boneyards in Arizona and Southern California. By late 1946, hardly a B-24 remained in flying condition. While the B-24 Liberator outnumbered all other American heavy bombers of World War II, its key role in the air campaigns against Germany and Japan has been eclipsed by the more popular and beloved Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Never a plane to generate much passion with its crews, the B-24 nonetheless formed the backbone of the 15th, 13th, 5th, and 7th Air Forces and flew on some of the most important missions of the war. Liberators dropped more bombs than any other American heavy bomber during the war, doing so while taking heavy losses from flak and fighters. Though it never became a true legend in aviation history, as did the B-17 and the B-29, the Liberators served as the Army Air Force's most versatile workhorse. Said one Liberator pilot, "It was good enough to get the job done."